Hi, so I'm Ella Houston. I'm part of the subject of disability and education at Liverpool Hope University. I'm delighted to introduce Sharon Smith, who is a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, where she is researching the subjectivity of parents of children labelled with special educational needs / disability, and the impact of this subjectivity on inclusion. So if I can just address the focus of Sharon's presentation today. Sharon will be presenting on the role of risk in relation to special educational needs and disability. In this presentation, Sharon will discuss how, since the 1990s, there has been an increased focus within education on keeping pupils safe and anticipating risks of problems such as negative outcomes or future underachievement, resulting in the quotation marks at risk label being applied to some students who then require greater observation and protection. Disabled students are often seen as more vulnerable than the general school population, subject to even greater monitoring and risk management than their peers. This seminar argues that the move within education towards risk management is problematic as students' futures are calculated and managed, and they are exposed to disciplinary power over their future outcomes. Yet the future of the other is not something that should be comprehended in the present, nor should there be any contempt to contain it. The future of others is not ours to control and should remain a mystery. This therefore requires the welcoming rather than management of risk in education. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Smith.
Thank you to Professor Bolt for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Houston, for your introduction as well. So the presentation today is based on a topic that I've been researching for the past couple of years, and is something that I hope to develop further within my PhD research. To give some background before I start my presentation, I want to explain where my personal interest in the topic has come from. So my daughter, who you can partially see on the photograph on the screen, was born 15 years ago, and after a very dramatic and very quick entrance into this world, we found out that she has Down syndrome. And it's because of my experiences of being her parent that I'm here today. So she's currently in mainstream education, which has absolutely had its highs and its lows for her and for us as her parents. And choosing a mainstream setting for her has made us feel like sometimes we are actually putting her in a more risky situation because of the dominant discourses relating to risks that suggest that disabled children will be subject to isolation or exclusion, or they might be bullied. Her school have also approached her inclusion, or her schools to date have approached her inclusion, also with a view to potential risks as well in the discussions that they have with us. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Her junior school, when we were in a meeting with them, and we said to them, as she was approaching towards year 5 and year 6, that we would like her to have more independence in the playground. We were hearing from sort of other parents that their children didn't want to play with her anymore in the playground because she had a learning support assistant attached to her the whole time. So we said it would be great if the learning support assistant could step back, and maybe she could go and just play in the playground like all of the other children. And they said that was fine, as long as she wore a high-vis yellow tabard in the playground. Because basically they felt that that was the way to keep her safe. Now, this was a child who has never attempted to leave the school grounds, has never harmed other children, and at this point had never been bullied or harmed by other children either. So they actually wanted to put a physical bright yellow jacket on her so that they could see her and identify her to minimise the risks. I'm not quite sure what risks they were. And so I became interested in ideas relating to risk, but also I became interested in ideas about how we are possibly anticipating things more for children with special education needs or disabled children. And again, another example, as she's currently in year 10 at school, we were getting into discussions in year 9 about what subjects she might be able to do in the mainstream school for her GCSE years. She's not accessing GCSEs. So they told us that she wouldn't be able to do science. But then they announced a new foundation course for science, which was aimed at the lower level children who were going to be doing lower level GCSEs. So we said, well, that would be perfect, much easier for you to differentiate the content, for her to be in that classroom. And they came back and they said, actually, no, it's not going to be suitable for her because we don't think that in the future she will achieve a GCSE. So she can't be in that class. So both of these things and various other, in fact, lots of incidents like these, have got me thinking about ideas relating to risk and the future. And that's what I'm wanting to present to you today. Towards the end, it does get quite theoretical. So if you just bear with me, I will go quite slowly in those sections. Okay, so what I'm wanting to argue is that we need more risk in education. And as you can see, there's a quote on the screen from Geert Biester. It says, it's not fashionable to argue that education ought to be risky. I would say it's even more unfashionable to argue that education for disabled children and children with special educational needs should be more risky. But that's what I'm going to do, because I think we need more risk. And actually, I think the inclusion of disabled children in mainstream education requires people who are willing to take those risks. So Biester has described how policymakers, politicians, and the public are attempting to take the risk out of education, desiring an education that is risk-free at all levels. Whilst recognising that disabled students, like my daughter, are potentially more vulnerable, and we obviously don't want to put people at risk of harm, and we don't want to do anything where people are in an unsafe situation. But I do think that there is a concern that education that's based on predetermined outcomes or predictions of predetermined outcomes and risk minimisation can result in an education that is either limiting or exclusionary or both. So my presentation today, I'm going to be drawing on Foucault's theory of power to argue that the current risk discourse, specifically in relation to these students, has resulted in a temporal shift in power. So the language of risk and focus on future outcomes that has become established results in power being exerted over an individual's future and over their potential in order to prevent bad things from happening. So both disabled children and those who are labelled with special educational needs are being subject now to risk-averse policies and practice that are prioritising the prevention of bad things from happening rather than embracing what might happen if risks were actually taken. So, as I say, I'm going to argue that we want to be taking those risks and that it's really important for children to do so. So in my talk, there's 5 main areas, main sections. And the first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about how risk has become attached or how it's being discussed in relation to children with special educational needs. And within that, my primary focus is around how parents talk about risk and what might happen if they send their children to mainstream school. I'm then going to talk about the creation of these uncertain subjects and talk about power and using Foucault's theory of power to discuss the nature of risk, where I'm going to argue that that discourse has resulted in the temporal shift in power. And then at the end, I'm going to draw on the ethics from Emmanuel Levinas. He presents an alternative conception of time and risk, which I think could be used to rethink how we actually are approaching inclusion. And he talks about the need to encounter the new and the strange, and for us to be interrupted and called into a responsibility to the other. So, what I want to talk about first is how parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities sometimes talk about or think about their children in relation to risks of potentially of mainstream education. So there are multiple ways of thinking about risk in relation to disabled children or those labelled as having special needs. So it could be that there's a risk that these children are, there's something that they're going to be a danger to themselves, or they may be a danger to other people, or they might experience danger from other people. Lalvani, who is also, like myself, a mother of a daughter who has Down syndrome, has undertaken a study where she talks to parents of other, basically other parents who have children with Down syndrome. And she's talked to them about the school placements and why some parents chose mainstream school and others chose specialist provision. And the parents who chose specialist provision for their children were particularly concerned that if, and they didn't know this was definitely going to happen, but it's a maybe, if they went to mainstream school, those children would be laughed at or made fun of in the inclusive setting, or they might be ignored or left out. They could lack friends and they might be isolated. And it was these reasons that those parents chose a specialist placement instead, where they felt that, one parent particularly used the land of misfits. And she said, my child will fit in the land of misfits and they'll be safe there and they'll be welcome. Rafferty and Griffin have also carried out a similar study looking at risk and what parents think about risk. And they found very similarly that parents were concerned that their children would be rejected and that they would be left out both by students and teachers. And also they thought there might be a lack of specialist support or specialist knowledge with the teachers. So these are risks that might happen to a child who has special needs and disability. And it might affect their safety, their emotional well-being, and also their understanding of self in relation to others. Rafferty and Griffin, in their study, also spoke to parents of typically developing children as well, and asked them about what they thought the risks of inclusion for disabled children might be. And perhaps not unexpectedly, their responses were not about the disabled child at all, but they were about their own children. And they answered things such as they thought that the disabled child might take away the resources or the teacher's attention away from their children. They saw that as a risk. They thought that a disabled child might frighten or injure their child, and again, they saw that as a risk. And they thought their own child might learn negative behaviours from a disabled child. So here, there's a notion of risk that other people are attaching to disabled children, where their presence in the classroom is being perceived as a risk to other people. And then I wanted to look at risk in relation to the school itself. And disabled pupils and those with special educational needs can also be perceived as a risk to the wider school. For instance, they can potentially damage school results and league table positions, or they could be a more significant draw on the limited school resources, requiring too much money to be spent on them. And Gert Biesta has described how the current task of schooling is to ensure that predefined learning outcomes are achieved, which requires an education that is strong, secure, predictable, and risk-free. And this desire for a risk-free education requires the student to be made fit for the education system and its requirement for certain skills and knowledge to be gained within a particular time frame, rather than the education system being changed to be more responsive to individuals. But as we know, not all children can easily fit within the current system with its demands. So I started also to look a little bit, very briefly, at policy, and I looked at the Special Educational Needs Codes of Practice. And in 2001, educators were asked to consider the level of progress that a pupil was making, and where that progress was not adequate, that's when they needed to put extra provision in place. 14 years later, the latest version of the Special Needs Code of Practice has changed that wording slightly. And what it says now is that a teacher, when deciding whether to make special education provision, should consider the pupil's progress, but they also need to consider expectations of progress. So we have a slight shift there. It's not just about the progress they're making, but what progress they may or may not make in the future. And to determine whether a child has special educational needs, it's no longer a case of just looking at what needs they might have today, but also within that definition, teachers are asked to look at what risk there is of underachievement in the future. So within this new code of practice, what we have is students who are disabled, who are frequently seen as more vulnerable and at risk of harm, those who have now been identified with special educational needs, and those who are identified at risk of failure, possibly in the future, all being brought together within the umbrella of one policy document. And I became interested in then how that document is requiring this new focus on future outcomes. And that's what education and health and social care needs to be directed towards. And these outcomes need to be directed towards 4 predefined normative preparing for adulthood themes, which include employability and independent living. Now, as a parent, I have 2 children. I have my 15-year-old daughter who has Down syndrome, and I have a 17-year-old who is currently maybe studying for his A-levels at home right now. And he has no idea what he wants to do with the rest of his life. And actually, we've let him make his choices along the way, and some of them have been very arbitrary and potentially might not have made the right decisions. But as parents, we've allowed him to make those mistakes. And actually, it's through making mistakes that we learn things. But with our children who have disabilities and special educational needs, we're having to plan for their future outcomes at a much earlier stage than I would ever have considered to do for my son. In fact, I'm already having to think about my daughter's adulthood, whereas my 17-year-old is nowhere near even thinking about what, he turns 18 in 4 months and has no clue. And that's not me being disrespectful to him. Gert Biester again has argued that this desire for a risk-free education denies the fact that other human beings have their own ways of being and thinking and their own reasons and motivations. So I became concerned around this idea of future outcomes based on potential future underachievement or potential future risks of what might happen or what might go wrong. So Armstrong has argued that risk has now come to replace need as the core principle in education policy. And Castle has said this shift has led to a new mode of systematic pre-detection that anticipates and aims to prevent the emergence of undesirable outcomes. So as a parent of a disabled child, I'm required to look at what positive outcomes we need to achieve, and we need to make sure that what society sees as undesirable for her doesn't happen. And as I will go on to explain, I think that this new risk-based approach has resulted in a new form of disciplinary power which has extraordinary scope over disabled children and children labelled with special needs. It not only is attempting to control children in their actuality today, but it's actually focusing on and trying to control what they might become in the future as well. So I'm going to go on and talk now about, I missed that slide, sorry, about the nature of risk. Bialystok has described how risk brings the future into the present and makes it something that is calculable. Rather than an education that is recognising that the future is absolutely undetermined and that students are still becoming, which offers infinite possibilities, both negative and positive, of course. And there is currently an attempt to eradicate risk, and there is this desire for total control over the educational process. So this move from assessing needs to assessing risks is potentially an attempt to control and manage the future of a student, and to control their future and their potential. Robbins has described how risk is a relative concept that works to produce uncertain subjects, as well as corresponding policies and practices. And Beck has described how there will always be winners and losers in risk definitions, and I'll come on to explain why that is. So in an education system that is based on developing a skilled workforce and a productive, independent citizens, it appears that children with special educational needs and disabilities are actually often the losers here, because they can be identified as being at greatest risk of negative future outcomes as they struggle to meet the ever-increasing demands within our education system. Those who do not, who cannot comply, those who are the misfits within our education system, are deemed to be at risk and in need of transformation based on the probability that they may deliver unwanted outcomes at some undefined point in the future. Their future potential is a risk that now needs to be managed. So I then started to look at, where did this discourse come in? Where did we actually start thinking about risk rather than need? And it goes back to the 1990s. And at the beginning of the 1990s, child welfare services in the UK were required to identify high-risk cases of child protection, where they needed to protect children from harm, for instance, from violence or sexual abuse. But during the 1990s, there was a shift from concern about those children to wider concerns about safeguarding and promoting the welfare of all children to ensure optimum life chances and a successful transition to adulthood. Interventions were now being required not just to prevent harm, but to prevent future problems in later life, such as low educational achievement, crime, antisocial behaviour and unemployment. All children were potentially seen as vulnerable to a form of risk and might require help. So with children who were previously deemed at high risk of harm and who needed protection in the immediate time, there was an imminent threat. There was something that was likely to happen, a high probability. But now what we've got is this shift to a concept of risk that's based on potential problems in the future, where there's not necessarily even any evidence that something's going to go wrong. And I think that demonstrates the start of this temporal shift in power to a form of disciplinary power over an individual's calculable future. I always struggle with that word, I apologise. So in 2003, we have the Every Child Matters Green Paper that was published, and within that, it introduced a national programme that was designed to maximise opportunity and minimise risk for all children from 0 to 19. And these were later introduced in policy in the 2004 Children Act. And Parton has said that this was a considerable broadening of objects of concern from child abuse and significant harm to children and young people who were just now were at risk of not fulfilling their potential. Now, these reforms that came in with Every Child Matters were based on a model that was derived from the public health approach, whereby a number of risk factors are actually identified. These are characteristics that forecast the probability of future negative outcomes, and then interventions will be introduced as a result of those characteristics being applied. So there was a vast apparatus that was erected to secure the well-being of the general population, and this risk factor model became instrumental in promoting this strategy of risk reduction. And I think this model seems to also be evident, as I say, in the Children and Families Act and the Code of Practice that we have now, with its focus on future outcomes and interventions being put in place for those that are at risk of underachievement in the future. So there has been a shift from seeking to identify deficits, so the medical model, and problems located within an individual, to now actually looking to identify potential risks which need addressing before there is a deficit or a problem. So interventions now need to be started as early as possible, even before anything has necessarily gone wrong. And they are being put in place to correct and train an individual now to manage their future time. And this has become possible because of the specific nature of risk and how it allows the future to be calculated and known. And the education of children with special needs and disability is now being directed at minimising future problems, but with an illusion of scientific objectivity, which is how Armstrong's described it, where there's an implication that risks and the likelihood of the effect of those risks upon future behaviour can actually be measured. The future is now something that can be calculated, predicted and managed. Oops. Okay. So the term risk in everyday language is a synonym for danger or peril, and it designates an objective threat. Risk used to be associated with danger embodied within an individual who might have been capable of violent or unpredictable actions, people who carried a threat to others in society and potentially then were excluded by being put into an institution to keep the rest of society safe. But as Castle has described, as soon as that notion of risk was made autonomous from the idea around danger, as seen with the Every Child Matters agenda, there is now no need to exclude individuals based on their actual behaviours or attributes. Instead, the whole population is under this new mode of surveillance, where there is anybody can be target for this preventative intervention, depending on what characteristics and what risks they are seen to have. Ewald has described that there is no such thing as an individual risk. Risk can only be determined by looking at the whole population and calculating an individual's risk in relation to other people. So it's not just about the person, but it's how much risk they are in or have compared to other people. Nothing is a risk in itself. There is no risk in reality, nothing that risks don't actually exist, but actually are determined by what we think is either dangerous or unwanted in our society. And that will therefore depend on the values that are seen as important for any given population. So for there to be a focus of intervention, it's no longer necessary for an individual to actually have any symptoms of dangerousness or abnormality. Instead, it's enough that they display whatever characteristics the specialists have decided are risk factors. It's no longer necessary for a pupil to be showing that they have delays or deficits that require intervention or fixing, or that they are in any immediate danger of harm from others, but instead risk allows it to be that we're predicting what might happen and then we're managing things as a result of those predictions. Individuals are becoming defined by a deduction of their risks based on an assessment of what dangers we want to avoid in the future. And those risks are relative to other people in the population. So some members of the population will always carry a greater risk in comparison to others. And as I've tried to explain, I think children with special educational needs and disabilities are seen to be either high risk themselves or at high risk of harm. So Bialystok has also argued risk, therefore, is a primary technique of government and a form of disciplinary power, which is working through and upon individuals to control their conduct in relation to desired future goals. Individuals will be observed, assessed and judged, and then their risks will be calculated. So individuals then are distributed in a network of relations where they're compared to each other based on the level of risk. And as I said, I think that within this, as Beck says, there are losers and winners, and I think that children with disabilities and special needs are the losers, and indeed the label special needs and at risk are often synonymous. So the governmentality perspective, which is developed from Foucault's theory of power, explores risk in the context of surveillance, discipline and regulation of populations, and how concepts of risk construct particular norms of behaviour that are used to encourage individuals to engage voluntarily in self-regulation in response to those norms. Almack has described how this leads to assumptions about risks which then shape the behaviour of individuals who are now being expected increasingly to engage in behaviours that minimise risk. And this is that individuals need to minimise risk for themselves, but also for people for whom they're responsible. And as a result, RMAT goes on to say, parents are being obliged to adopt a calculative and prudent approach to risk and danger for their children. And they're being encouraged to decide on the best and least risky course of action for their offspring's future. Ansgar Allen has described how our current dominant logic requires individuals to work within a likely future, where the likely futures of pupils in school can be calculated based on statistics and test results, which will then allow us to construct intervention plans which will ensure positive future outcomes are achieved. He further describes how individuals are required to adopt perspectives and strategies that make life realistic and manageable. And when I read that, it reminded me again of some of the things that I've read around the current code of practice in the UK, about how we are being, again, as parents, we're being encouraged to come up with realistic future outcomes for our children. So the latest code of practice says that aspirations for children and young people will be raised through this increased focus on life outcomes. Children with special educational needs or disabled children and their parents are required to agree and plan for education, health and care support to achieve these agreed future outcomes. But parents are being encouraged to agree outcomes that are realistic and achievable, and that's in, those words are actually in quite a lot of documentation around outcomes. And the code says that outcomes should always enable children to move towards long-term aspirations of education, of employment or higher education, independent living and community participation. So what we're seeing is this shift away from need as being the dominant part of the education system to actually looking at outcomes. And as Leah Birch has said, these outcomes are based on a particularly normative creation of the autonomous, self-regulating, self-correcting subject. I've looked at some of the work that Besley and Peters have done looking at risk, and they've described that the regulation of risk takes place through the responsibilisation of the individual. So we're increasingly being required and forced, they say, to become responsible for our own safety, health, employment and education. And parents and children with special educational needs are being required to make what they class as a series of investment decisions about the future of our children. And we as parents are now responsible for ensuring that the risk of things such as future unemployment or dependence on the state is minimised. So, as I've argued, disciplinary power has extended temporarily, as Foucault's normalising judgment has extended over not just what progress a child is making now, but what progress they may make, and is based on their future being calculated and known now according to predetermined risk factors and positive outcomes that everybody's in agreement with. But students with special educational needs and disability are not at risk because of anything that exists inherently within them, but these risks are determinations based on what society expects and values. Foucault described in his writing about time and power that power is exercised over an individual's time within education, for instance through timetabling and a mapped out curriculum or examinations that test progress at set times. But with risk replacing need as this core principle of education policy, as Armstrong has described, power is now being extended over future time as well as current time. And we believe that it is possible to calculate an individual's future and make necessary interventions if they're actually going to be a risk in the future. In Risk Society, Ulrich Beck describes how risks must always be imagined, implied to be true and believed, because nothing is a risk in itself. There is no risk in reality. And that means anything can be a risk, depending on what's determined to be dangerous or unwanted. Beck further describes that definitions of risk are not dependent on any scientific validity, but rather they are to do with the anticipation of what has not yet happened but is seen as threatening. So because power and knowledge are now not based on observable facts, and instead knowledge is being calculated about something that might happen, this does offer this extraordinary scope of power and subjection over students that are disabled or have special needs. Now, Beck has claimed that the essential and momentous consequence of a move to a discourse based on risk is that it allows a breakaway from the dominant objective rationality of science that has dominated previously some of those discussions around disability and special educational needs. Within the at-risk discourse, knowledge is not of something that actually exists, but is only anticipated or believed to be true. And it depends on what society values as a life worth living. Beck argues, therefore, that within any discussion of risk, it is necessary for us as society to be asking, how do we wish to live? And he says it also means we need to assume an ethical point of view if we are to discuss risks meaningfully at all. So the move to a future-orientated education based on what might happen and what might become is something that cannot be objectively known and only predicted. But this gives us an opportunity to actually insist that we need to look at more of an ethical approach to what we're doing in terms of education for children with disabilities and special needs. So for the final part of this paper, I want to consider an ethical conception of risk and an ethical conception of the future. And for this, I'm turning to Emmanuel Levinas. And this is quite theoretical, so I do apologise. So, Levinas, rather than conceiving the future of the other as something that is managed and controlled, Levinas conceives the future as showing up through an ethical relation with the other person. He describes how it is necessary for us to expose ourselves to risk, to be able to respond and act with an ethical relation of responsibility that respects the alterity and time of the other. This means we need to be conscious and present for the other, rather than any attempt to exceed the present time in a project that might anticipate the future. And he argues that this presence requires us to be exposed to risk. So Levinas talks about the other as somebody who is infinitely transcendent and infinitely foreign. There is an absolute difference and a strangeness of the other person that we cannot ever fully know, and we cannot reduce them to our thoughts and our interpretations. He uses the concept of the face to describe this further, where the face is someone who expresses himself as an other than I, someone who is different to me. That face cannot be reduced to an idea, category, need, or indeed a calculable risk. They resist my powers and my possession. So Putnam has described that for a genuine ethical relation to another, it presupposes that you recognise the other person as an independent reality and is not your construction. And I think that's something really important for parents of disabled children to be recognising and realising. And this is because infinity cannot be known, and there cannot be any limits placed on infinity, and it cannot be calculated. So if the other person is potentially infinitely different to us, we can't attempt to know them. And often I hear parents talking about how they know their child more than anybody else, but I would not ever claim to know my daughter. She certainly knows her own mind. So instead of an attempt to discipline the future of the other, which is infinite and is unknown, Levinas proposes that we should have a relation that is based on the otherness of the other, which does involve a positive, or what he calls a fine risk, where we put ourselves into a position of vulnerability and exposure to meet that responsibility for the other. He argues that what is necessary is a risky uncovering of oneself, where we can respond to other people without a shell to protect ourselves. And this exposure involves taking risks. So through being exposed to other people and allowing ourselves to not try to control them or not try to put our wishes and our desires on them, then basically we can expose ourselves to what he calls is basically we're opening ourselves onto a dimension that is a discovery. And there is a risk there of nonsense and a madness, he says. But that's important for us to actually be able to respond appropriately to other people through this ethical relation. Levinas has said that the future is what is not grasped, and instead he describes the other as the future. The very relationship with the other is the relationship with the future, and therefore we shouldn't be attempting to control or discipline the future, but should welcome it in its infinity. He also provides an alternative dimension for the meaning of time. So rather than the notion of time being derived by society, he describes how, given that the other is infinite and unknowable, it's impossible to have universal or measurable time, because this would be a reduction of the other person's time to our time. So he again argues that time must be considered in its dimension of awaiting or anticipation, and there shouldn't be any anticipating aiming. Therefore, the consideration of the future can only be accomplished in a face-to-face relationship and that responsibility for the other person, rather than looking at anticipated risks and trying to agree future outcomes as we see in education today. So I'm arguing that students, disabled children and those who are labelled with special educational needs shouldn't be being defined in relation to risks that relate to their future, but instead their alterity and their difference provides us with a different way of actually conceiving what the future could look like. So just to conclude, Biesta has described how the desire for education to be risk-free and put under total control, rather than an education that might be slow, difficult, frustrating, denies the fact that what and who we are other to us is precisely that, is other. So other people are other to us, we can't control them. And it also denies the fact that education always deals with human subjects and not inanimate objects. And humans will learn in their own way and in their own time. Therefore, a risk-free education and the labelling of students of being at risk of failure because they haven't met expected levels of attainment or might not do in the future is seeking to control both their present actions and time and the future of the other. But Levinas has argued the time of the other is not ours to control. He argues the future of the other is not something we should attempt to anticipate. Rather, it comes as the multi-layered traumas of overtaxing obligations and responsibilities for the yet to come futurity of the other person. So rather than an education based on instrumentalist goals and future outcomes, which homogenises people in a way that betrays their dignity of difference and closes down learning, Levinas offers an alternative conception of teaching and learning, where educators, and also I would argue parents, need to put themselves in a position to receive and welcome the other in their alterity and in their infinity. Their future is not something that should be comprehended in the present, and we shouldn't be attempting to contain it, but there should be a relationship with the future, which Levinas describes as the temporal transcendence of the present towards the mystery of the future. And he says that that can actually be a really destabilising experience, and it runs the risk as well, Todd has described, of educators and parents being challenged and discredited. But I think that it's a risk that we need to take. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really, really interesting and partly frustrating presentation, but really good.
Thank you.
So we just got time for a couple of questions from here or comments and from Carlton as well. So if you wanted to ask any questions, just please put up your hand and then bring the mic to you. And just say your name and what institution you're from. That'd be great. So any questions?
Thanks for the presentation. My name is Samuel, Officer with Studies, MA. It looks as if achieving post-PhD education is highly attainable in Western world. My question is, how do we achieve the education in the developing countries, where disability is still perceived as though they are living in integrity?
Yeah, what I would say is I don't have any answers as to how we achieve this. certainly not even in Western society, rather than in other societies as well. But Levinas would say that it is about those relationships and about individuals and how they react and respond to other people. So I think it's for all individuals to be bearing this in mind. So I think it's really important, say, for myself as a parent, and by doing this research and thinking through some of these problems, it puts me in a really difficult position as a parent because I want the best for my daughter, and obviously I've got dreams and goals and all these things that I think would be great, but it's also really making me step back and think that her future is not mine, and, you know, I've got to try and support her in whatever way to achieve what she wants to do. And she may make mistakes and she may come to harm, but then again, so might my son. So it's, you know, it's about balancing that. And I don't have an answer to your question, I'm afraid, and I just wonder whether if anybody else in the room has anything that they would respond to your questions there. It's about individual relationships, primarily, I think, and our own responses and our responsibilities.
Hi, Leah Birch, University of Leeds and Liverpool Home. That was amazing, well done. It really got me thinking, especially about the positionality of you as a researcher and also as a mother. I was just wondering if you've got any examples of where you've maybe, you touched upon it there, but where you've felt that difficulty in maybe like speaking for that uncontained future and allowing the risks to embracing the risk really with both of the children.
Yeah, I think it's something now I've become a lot more aware of in terms of that sort of idea of risk, and I now think of everything in relation to that. And not even necessarily just about the future for my daughter. So an example that I have where I'm really I'm still grappling with it as a parent because of this work, is that she wants to be on social media. And children with disability, she has Down syndrome, and so it's a very visible disability, and also she has a learning disability, so her interactions on social media potentially are going to put her in a position where she's more at risk of people making fun of her. And certainly when she first tried to go on social media without me knowing a couple of years ago, some of the children in the school were making fun of her, and so then it's really hard, isn't it, because you sort of go, well, I don't want that to happen, and then I have to sort of step back and say, well, actually, there's a lot of benefits for her being on social media, and she can engage with people in a way that she can't necessarily do if she's just sat in her bedroom at home. And also, most teenage girls probably get bullied at some point on social media, and they learn from that, and you develop skills and knowledge, and I have to not limit her by stopping her doing it. So that's just one example. In terms of her future, at the moment she's 15, just turned 15 a month ago. She would tell you she's nearly 16. She has decided that the day she turns 18, she's moving out. And most of the reason for this is because of things that I don't let her do now as a parent. So I don't let her eat McDonald's 3 times a day, for instance, which is what she would really like to do. Or have a whole bottle of ketchup with her dinner, and all of these certain things. And also I don't let her post certain videos on the internet. She hasn't got a YouTube channel, which she would really like to have. So she's decided when she's 18, she's an adult and she can do what she wants. So she's moving out. Now, I don't think in all likelihood that the day she turns 18, she's going to move out. But at the moment, we're having to respect that. And we're trying desperately to get social care involved so that they could support her towards that wish, if that's really what she wants to do. And my heart would break if she moved out when she was 18. And I don't think she probably will, but we're having to do it. And I feel that she would be incredibly vulnerable if she was to do that at that stage. But I also think that there are certain risks that we have to take. And I think just every day, actually, for her and for us, inclusion in mainstream school is a risk, because there is always in the back of your mind, what if we had chosen special school? What could she be achieving now? She is in a situation in her mainstream school. It's a catchment school, but it's a very highly academic school. And for, I don't know, probably 40% of her week, she's in learning support now because it's GCSE years. And so they say they can't accommodate her levels in the GCSE lessons. And so it's like, well, okay, she says she's happy, but could she have been happier in a different setting? So I think as a parent, you can't win. And it's one of the quotes that I don't know if I mentioned it in this presentation or not, but certainly it's within my broader write-up of this, where parents probably can never win, and we've just got to do the best. So I think what I try to do in every interaction with her is try and let her have as much, say over her future as possible. It's hard.
Thank you. What's your daughter's name?
Tansy.
Tansy. I work in a mainstream primary school, and so I'd like to apologise to Tansy for making her aware that we had these.
Thank you.
It was ridiculous. I love the sentence you made. I don't fully understand it because I don't know what alterity means. Let me find out. But when you said to accept the other in their alterity and their infinity.
Yeah. So alterity is just difference. So it is the fact that the other person is just ultimately different to you, and infinitely so. And I think that's what we need to respect. So a lot of Levinas's work where he's talking about this is he's saying that by even trying to understand the other person, we are reducing them to our understanding and our conceptions and our values. And he argues against that. He says that is completely unethical to do, and that we have to respect that difference, but just respond to those people and what they need from us. And he also talks about how that doesn't need to be reciprocated. So it doesn't have to be a reciprocal relationship. We should just be there for other people and respect them as other human beings, I guess. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to do with my daughter, although that whole parent relationship makes it very hard.
Hello. I'm Michelle Worthington from Newman U.
Hello.
Yeah. I was just thinking, just the idea of blame culture and what role that plays in what you were researching. I was just thinking, my daughter's got CP, and so just from my perspective, personally, that blame culture has quite a profound kind of thing on what they think is a risk for her. So that feels less about the risk on her and more about the risk on the staff if something goes wrong.
Yes.
So there's that, and then with my research, I'm looking at directors working with disabled actors in theatre, and risk is quite a big part of their views on casting disabled actors. But again, that's more about avoiding blame, criticism, rather than risk for the actual person. I just wondered how that ties into what we're doing.
Yeah, I haven't yet looked at that. I think blame, there's two aspects, isn't there, with blame? So there's parent blame as well. So there's potentially that the school feel that if they take risks, that they might be blamed if things go wrong. One of the things that we have tried to do with my daughter's school is when we've pushed for certain things that they feel, well, we're not quite sure about that, we've kind of said to them, if this goes wrong, we're not going to blame you. As in, we'll tell you now up front that this is a joint decision and a joint discussion, and we'd really like to try this, and if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. But so I think one of the other things, and in fact it's one of the things I'm going to start looking at next, when you have risk and when you're wanting to take risk, there needs to be some level of trust, I think, in the other people. And so the school needs to trust that we're not going to blame them. And we as parents need to trust that we're not going to be blamed as well if things go wrong. And that comes again down to relationships, because you can't trust people without actually having some relationship and some expectations that actually, you know, you're going to work together on it. So one of the next things that I want to look at is trust. But I think now I might also bring blame into that as well. I think risk is just a really interesting concept because there are so many different angles and so many different ways of conceiving risk. But the problem is that often it's just those different nuances are not necessarily looked at in detail. I mean, I did the table, the 3 sort of columns with different ways of looking at risk, but actually there's lots more as well. And I just think there's a real, I was going to say risk, there's a real danger of us not looking at those risks and actually saying what is a positive risk and what's not. And again, one of the other things that I want to be looking at next, and I haven't yet got to, in fact, I only started reading this week, there's some work by Zinn, and so that's Z-I-N-N, and I've only just started reading his work, but he talks about people who take positive risks. So for instance, I can't remember what it's called, but you know there's people who like jump off buildings and do all of those clever somersaults and all of those things. Where he talks about, we would also, oh my goodness. Okay, sorry. That he, you know, we would say that that was risky behaviour, but actually they've really calculated it, they've worked it out, they've looked at where they can jump, where they shouldn't jump. There's a lot of knowledge has gone into that. So he's saying they're actually taking informed risks. It's not just about being, I don't know, reckless. And I think that's also something that I want to start looking at as well, that when we have made decisions for our daughter and we've taken decisions that other people think are risky on her behalf, actually we feel that we've taken quite informed risks rather than just being reckless because it's her life, and obviously we wouldn't do that. And again, I think that comes then to the blame thing as well, that if it hasn't been a reckless decision, you're less likely to blame people if it's something that, because you know things go wrong, don't they, in life, and that's part of the beauty of life, sort of. So things will go wrong, but we learn from them, we pick ourselves up and we support each other. So
thank you. Is there any question? Yeah, there's a question from Carlton.
Hi, Sharon. Ryan Patterson. I'm a history lecturer here. Thank you very much for an up and down, really interesting talk and a strong finish too. Thank you for that. I've got a question, Professor, on behalf of Professor Dominique Marshall. She had to scoot off to teach a class, but really loved your talk. I wanted to pass that on. And question about the risk assessment. You've part of the risk culture of education in the UK, and I think it's quite analogous over here as well, is the kind of like no child left behind, all child special. It's applied across the board. So the risk assessment you're talking about is applied to disabled children and non-disabled children. Do you see that the problem is that the risk assessment is fundamentally different for disabled children, or is it almost perversely the opposite, that in the desire to apply consistent risk assessment, now her different performance is being rated as lower, almost because it's being held on an even scale? Whereas, for example, you know, if she doesn't get to GCSEs, well, she could still benefit taking the course. That wasn't the point, unless we're comparing her to GCSE focused students. What's your take on that?
I think it's almost both. So I think that part of it is that idea of treating everybody the same and not making those individual adjustments, or I guess that's sort of coming back to what Levinas is talking about, that we need to be responsive to people as individuals rather than just these blanket policies and just saying, well, that's what's happening for everybody, so therefore that's how we need to treat you. So I think there is a problem with that, absolutely. But I also think that the idea of risk and the process of risk assessment, although they apply to all children, they actually fall heavier on children with special educational needs. So just again, some examples of things for myself. When my daughter was in year 4, so she would have been, I don't know, 8 or 9, their school take all the children swimming. And they basically came to me and immediately said, well, for her to be able to go swimming, we need you to come. We need you to come and sit on the side of the pool. And I said, but you haven't even asked me how well she can swim compared to other children. And they said, well, we're concerned she's going to take too much time to get changed. At the end of the lesson, you need to be there. I said, well, you haven't asked me how much time does she take to get changed. And actually, she was one of the quickest to get changed because we had anticipated. So this is where I think anticipation can be positive. We had anticipated that she was going to need to be able to do this. So we made sure she had swimming lessons and that she could change herself really quickly. And likewise, there was a residential trip in year 6. And again, their immediate reaction from the school was, well, we've looked at the risks, and it was an outward bound centre with things like big swings and, I don't know, canoeing and all of these sorts of things. And we've looked at the risks, and we don't think she necessarily will come. We don't know that she's going to enjoy it. We don't know that she'll manage anything. We think that she will be unhappy. And I said, well, you know, let's just talk about this. This is just because all you've seen is her disability. All you've seen is the fact she has Down syndrome, and you don't actually know that what happened in reality was she had a best friend who had no special needs at all, who became very anxious and didn't want to go. My daughter threw herself into every single activity and was absolutely fine and had no issues with sleeping and no issues with behaviour. She ate all the food that was given to her. So they were anticipating and suggesting that there were risks there just because of her disability. So the risk assessment wasn't actually an assessment of her. It was based on these stereotypes and understandings of what they thought Down syndrome meant. And I think that's what's problematic sometimes. It's not about being responsive. And, you know, as I said right at the very beginning of my presentation, we don't want to be putting children at harm. I'm not suggesting that I want my daughter's school to do things that are going to be harmful to her. So they do need to recognise the instances where certain behaviours or certain activities that the school are going to be doing could cause her harm. But that's again about this responsiveness to her as an individual and making sure that they can be flexible and adapt for her. So I think that answers both of the things you listed. That's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it now. So can we just thank John once again, please?